Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. Today we're going to talk about why using forEach is not a good choice in most situations. And some have gone so far as to say there is no place for forEach in modern JavaScript. I'm going to show you why along with several good alternatives. So let's get started. Okay, I've got Visual Studio Code here on the left, and on the right I have got Chrome DevTools with the console available right here. So when we first learn about using forEach, we think it's great because we don't have to write out all the syntax of the traditional for loop. So we could put a forEach loop into action. Actually, let me put it into a function that we can call. So I'll call this use forEach. We'll pass in the IDs array that I have up above that just contains the numbers 1 through 10. And then inside this function, we'll take the IDs and we'll call forEach, and then we'll have forEach ID. And then let's just log to the console each of the IDs. And then after that, of course, we need to call this function into action. So we'll put it up here in the init app function, and we'll say use forEach, and we'll pass in the IDs. And what I've got here is an array of IDs, and then I've got a document add event listener that listens for the DOM content loaded event. And when the DOM content is loaded, we call the init app function, which is right here, that would kick off the whole web app if we were building a web app. But I'm just calling this use forEach function we just created inside of the init app function. So once the DOM content is loaded, that will be called into action. We can save this. And you see in the console over here, we log the numbers 1 through 10. Everything works as expected. And the fact is when we're learning JavaScript, we use console log a lot. And it's a side effect. What that means is it's not something returned by the function. It affects something outside of the function. It's definitely not for use in a pure function, which I have a separate tutorial on. But before I get off track, the point being is forEach allows us to loop through something, but it doesn't return anything. And that immediately makes it less useful than the other higher order functions, say like map, that do return something like a new array. But what I really want to focus on today is why using async and await with forEach is no good. So let's take a look at why. I'm going to start by pasting in another async function, and this is going to make an API request using fetch to JSON placeholder, and we're going to fetch some IDs. It looks like I need to wrap the code so you can see the end of the URL, but you see we're passing in an ID here each time. And also notice that I am awaiting the JSON method. I'm doing this all in one line here, so oftentimes you'll see result equals await fetch, and you get the results from fetch, and then you take those results and you call the JSON method. Well, I just put it all in one line by putting the await fetch in parentheses and then another await on the outside here and the .json at the end, and I'm returning that. So if you haven't seen that before, it's not really anything new. I just made it one line where you usually see 2 or 3 lines awaiting, say, const result equals fetch, and then awaiting the result.json, and you might return that line, or you might have even set that equal to data and then return data on a third line. It's all in one line. Anyway, that's our get post function. It's async, and we're going to use it inside of forEach to show why forEach is a bad idea with async await. First of all, let's take this console log and put it on a separate line, and then we need to add the curly braces for that to get our forEach correct. There we go, down here at the bottom. And now if we're going to use get post inside of here, and we'll use it with the IDs because we can pass each individual ID into this URL with get post, what we need to do is once again say forEach ID, and we're looping through the IDs, but we would want to call async right here because forEach does call a function. So if you were trying to use async with forEach, that's where it would go. Then instead of logging here, we would want to await and then have get post and pass in the ID. And then let's go ahead and set this equal to data. So let's say const data. This is just the raw data that we get back from JSON placeholder. And then let's go ahead and just log this data that we get back. Now, there will be an issue here, and we'll look at the console to see what the issue is. So once again, we're still calling use forEach up here. We're still passing in the array of IDs, but now we're using that array of IDs and calling each ID inside of the forEach loop, and we're calling getPost inside of that. Now, let's see if we get the results we expect. I'll go ahead and save, and we should see a change over here. Let me maybe shrink this text inside of the console so we can see it just a little bit better, and that's a little blinding there from Visual Studio Code. So let me pull this back up. There we go. So we've got the dark theme going everywhere, which is easier on my eyes. I hope it's easier on your eyes too. So if we scroll up here to the top, user ID, but look, the first ID that we've got in the console is 9, and then 10, and then 2, and then 7, and 3, and I think you see a problem here. Really, forEach isn't waiting on any promise to fulfill at all. It's just rocketing through that information. And so we're not getting this back in the order we requested it. So it's definitely not a synchronous order as far as our array is concerned. It's just kind of throwing away those promises and going ahead and calling the data. And what's worse than that, see, it doesn't return anything. So we can't really put async up here. Let me try to do this here. I've got caps lock on. There we go. Async, and then you would think, okay, we could put await here, but it doesn't return anything, so we're not awaiting anything. So I can put a console log down here and say, I'm not waiting, and there we go. Oh, that's a problem. Quotation marks, and get the correct quotation mark here since I'm using a single quote inside. So I'm not waiting in the console log. Go ahead and save this, and notice I'm not waiting is not at the bottom. It's up here at the very top because we didn't await for anything to resolve here. So this async here and the await here is really doing us no good. And we can't let our forEach loop resolve these promises that we would get from getPost and then do something here. And we don't know what order we would receive them back in either. So let's look at some good alternatives to replace this where we don't want to use forEach with Async Await. Okay, I'm just going to paste this function over the use forEach function, and it's called getPost serialized. We can look at this, it's an async function, and we're using a traditional for loop because why use a sledgehammer when we just have the accurate tool that we need? Even though you may not like writing out all the details of a traditional for loop where we define, say, the iterator here, let I, and then you've got I less than the length of the array that's passed in, and then we increment I. That's your standard for loop. But look, we can await getPost, and we can log the data, and there's no separate function. This isn't a higher order function, so it's just part of the greater function overall. And therefore, we can async on the getPost serialized, the overall function, and await getPost. And then notice I've got this I'll wait on you down here just to show that we can get through this for loop, wait on the data in the serialized order. And that's why I said serialized. It should keep it in the post order ID 1 through 10, and everything should go as expected. So I'm going to take this and replace our use forEach in the init app function. And I'll scroll back down where we can see this better and save. And let's look in the console. Oh, I've got a problem. getPost serialized has already been declared in my code. And save. Now, I had getPost serialized declared just a little bit lower before as well. So I fixed that. Now I've got all wait on you at the bottom. So the console log statement didn't happen until we got through the for loop. And notice number 10 is here at the bottom. And as I scroll up, it should be in the correct order. And yes, everything is. So we start with ID of 1, then ID of 2, and count right on through number 10. So it may not be as cool as using a higher order function, but a simple for loop will get the job done with async and await in the serial order that we need. Now, although the for loop works, in modern JavaScript we have a better solution, and I'm going to paste this in just underneath so you can compare, or if you want to pause the screen and look at both to see the difference. But if we use a for of loop, we can really eliminate some of that tedious syntax of the regular for loop, and we can iterate through an array. So here we have for ID of IDs, and then we basically have the same thing here where we await get post and we're logging the data. And now I'll just get rid of this for loop and we'll go ahead and save, and we'll see we get the same thing in the console, and we also still get it in the serialized order 1 through 10. So I'll wait on you is here at the end, and we get the same order we needed, starting with 1 and ending with 10. So this is how I would write this if I was just going for a simple solution. But let's look at a couple of other solutions as well. So far, I've focused on solutions that would keep the posts serialized. That is, delivering them back in the order that we kind of feed the function 1 through 10, or the for loop just in itself. However, if that's not such a concern, let me paste another solution down here, and I called this get posts concurrently. Shout out to James Q. Quick that has a great video on, I would say, Promise.all, I guess was what he was focused on, but he was also talking about parallel versus concurrent, and he chose to use the verbiage concurrently, which I agree with. You will see some people say get the request in parallel, but that's not quite fitting the definition as good as concurrently. So I agree with James there. Thank you, James. So let's look at this function. We've got get post concurrently. It's an async function, but now we're getting something back. We're getting something back from a Promise.all here, as a matter of fact, and we're using a higher order function map. Notice this line is wrapping, so at the very end we're calling get post as well. But map returns an array. So what happens here is we get an array of promises to resolve. This will resolve them all at once. So notice we don't have the await in front of get post. We have the await in front of Promise.all. And then once we get all of those posts, they're resolved here. And notice I do have the all wait on you because unlike forEach, map is returning something, and then it's all being resolved here at the very end. So I'm going to go ahead and change this up in our init function. I can leave the get post serialized definition here, but up here, I'll just replace it with get post concurrently, and let's save. Now we may get these in order, or we may not, but the key is, and here we're seeing the bright background as well, but the key is that it's faster. And so what happens here is we're getting the full arrays the way I logged it. And because we get them back all at once as well. But here is ID of 1, and I guess I need to go down here to look at the next one, ID of 2. So apparently they are in order right now, but it's not guaranteed to be that way. We won't necessarily get them back in that same order. So let's come back to Visual Studio Code. That is so bright when I look at it that way. But what I wanted to point out is this is faster if the serial order isn't as important to you. However, now Promise.all, and I could do a separate video on Promise.all, if one of the promises fails, they all fail. So what you would want to do if you wanted to check the status, allowing some to fail and some not to fail and still get something back, you would use Promise.all settled. And let's go ahead and do that as well. I'll save this now, and you'll see the object we get back is just a little bit different. It has a status here, and it says fulfilled, and then it has the value that has what we were looking at before. So Promise.all settled is just a little bit different than Promise.all. Okay, I'm going to change back to the get post serialized, and we're going to redefine that function once again. It may look a little complex for some of you that are not as used to higher order functions, so I would suggest if you're not, go over higher order functions, especially reduce, because that's what we're going to use, and we're going to use it in a way that's different than it's usually used. Okay, I'm going to start with await because reduce does return a value. So I'm going to put await here, which will allow us to await all of the results. And then I'll call reduce on the IDs array that is passed in. And now inside of reduce, I'm going to use async again. And reduce has an accumulator, and then of course we'll have an ID from the IDs. So for each ID essentially. And now we'll come into the body of the function. The first thing we're going to do is await the accumulator. Now that seems a little strange, but what that does, and I'll put a note here, is it waits for the previous item, let's say, to complete. So instead of accumulating numbers, like if we fed it this array and it totaled up the numbers, this is essentially waiting for the previous promise to resolve. And then after that, let's get the next item. And what that is our const post, and that's going to equal await, and then we'll call get post and pass in the ID. Now here we can log the individual posts one at a time, of course, as it goes through the loop. And then reduce, although you don't always see it, reduce also accepts an initial value that comes after the function here. And what we need to put here is promise.resolve and call that into action too with the operators. And then once again, just so we can see that this will all finish with the await here before we would do anything else, let's go ahead and get our console log of all wait on you. And let's put it underneath the reduce, but it's still in our get post serialized function. And I believe I replaced that up here. Yep, so we're ready to call it. I'm going to save. And now let's look at the console. All wait on you is at the bottom. And now posts starting at the bottom with 10, counting backwards, going all the way to number 1. So they're still serialized. So let's break this down. And the best way to break it down really is to remove a piece at a time so you can kind of see what it does. So let's see what happens if we don't await the accumulator. And I'll go ahead and save. And now let's look. We've got ID of 9, ID of 1, ID of 2. So they're in this strange order. And look, all wait on you is here in the middle. So it really didn't wait. So we need to use that accumulator. What is happening is it's passing an unresolved promise to the accumulator, and then it's going ahead and resolving and completing there. So it's handing off a promise, which is a strange way to wrap your head around using reduce compared to the typical example of, say, getting the sum of all the numbers that are in the array and then just delivering that at the end. So we really need this accumulator here, and we need to await for it to resolve. Now what about this promise resolve here? Let's just go ahead and remove it. And I'll save once again. And we've got the all wait on you at the end. And we start with number 10 at the bottom, 9, counting backwards. But when we get to the start, there's no number 1. So this is the initial value. And we need that initial value to get our first value back. So that's why we need the promise resolve there. So I think we all understand what this does when we get the post and we're logging each individual post here. But then why do we have an await here outside of reduce? Now remember, reduce does return something. It would normally be like if we fed it the array of numbers, it would total all those together in the accumulator and return that. So let's not await something here and just remove the await and save and see what we get in the console. Well, we got number 10. We didn't get all wait on you though. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. So they're in order, but all wait on you is at the beginning instead of the end. So we need to wait here just so we can do something else afterwards after all of this is finished. And that's typically what we would want to do instead of having these still processing essentially or be unresolved before we did something else. Now, once you kind of wrap your head around how this works, this might actually be your preferred way of getting serialized results from async await when you pass in an array. And I have heard that people do prefer this as well because really it doesn't require as much code in a polyfill as, say, the, well, I guess I deleted it, but the for/of example. However, the for/of example is very succinct as well, and I believe that it's simpler to wrap your head around than this reduce solution. So either would work, and I just wanted to show you the different solutions you could use instead of using forEach that just won't work for you when it comes to using async await, and especially if you're requesting data from an API and you need to get that back in that specific serialized order. forEach is not going to help you out there. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.